what does this all mean, even if you are correct in your like projected timeline?
Yes, well, it does lend great credence, if my timeline is correct, to the Genesis account. That's one thing. Archaeologists have always acknowledged that the Genesis account is the most accurate roadmap, or the most trustworthy roadmap for archaeological endeavors in the Middle East since the earliest days of modern archaeology. So we know that the earliest histories leading back to Noah are extremely accurate. It's been the roadmap for archaeological endeavors. But the conventional scientists do not want Noah's flood to be true. They do not want the Genesis timeline to be true. Therefore, they will resort to saying human development through, and I'm not thinking, I forgot even what the question was. What was it again?
What is the significance of all this? If your theory is true, what does it mean to me today, Joe truck driver,
right,
flipping through, stuck on?
Well, you know,
yes.
Yeah, if the model that we're presenting here is true, if the model that we've been describing here is more accurate, which we think the evidence does show, it will show that the conventional Darwinian timeline is full of holes, and that what we've been taught all through our lives in public school and private school has been treated as writ. The fact of Darwinian development is not so. And many of us have suspected this, and many biologists admit that Darwinian timeline and Darwinian change is very suspect. So all that we've been taught should be called into question with this new information. It really raises much doubt on the Darwinian timeline, and it lends great credence to the Genesis account, an account which has never showed any flaw. It has never shown any inaccuracy. We need to keep that in mind. And in reality, the global flood model, without causing these vast sedimentary layers on the continents, does jibe with the global flood model and not with uniformitarianism. So we need to look long and hard at these two schemes, these two models, and you be the judge about which one fits the evidence better. You know, there's 500 legends from around the globe from ancient tribes that speak of a global flood. It wasn't just the Hebrews. All the ancient civilizations had legends of a global flood, including Egypt. A lot of people say Egypt didn't. They did. They had the tomb of Seti, the building text of the Seti's temple, who lived about 1800 BC, and the Edfu text also at the building text at the Edfu complex. Global flood. All Hittites had one even. The Hittites were thought to be mythological, a biblical figment of a Hebrew's imagination. No Hittite nation up until about 1940, and the Hittites were discovered. More verification that Genesis is accurate. What caused the Ice Age to begin? That's the big question. Conventional scientists say that it was because of cooling of the atmosphere. We've shown that no, it couldn't have been colder winters because you have less snowfall with colder winters. So that was not the reason. We have shown that it had to have been geothermal heating of the ocean water, or geothermal heating to warm the ocean water. We have shown that it could not be global warming to cause the warmer ocean water to cause an ice age. Oxymoronic. Global warming of the ice age doesn't make sense. Therefore, it had to be heating from below. Now, what caused this heating from below? We have a few indications from ancient legends. The ancient Teutonic tribes and some of the ancient Chinese tribes spoke of the earth hissing and steam and water venting forth through the earth as a global flood covered the earth. The Hebrew Bible speaks of the fountains of the deep, which would have hissed steam and water and magma from the bowels of the earth. Now something like this had to have been the cause for the warmer waters for the Ice Age. Now we'll look into that in our next program, and you all can look into yourself, see what theories you... But Bible says fountains of the deep. We'll look long and hard at that.
Does conventional science have an explanation for the onset of the Ice Age?
Yeah, the Milankovitch, the conventionals once again say that the Ice Age was caused by cooler temperatures because during the Milankovitch cycle, which was where the ellipse of the orbit of the Earth changes over time every 100,000 years. Once in 100, or through a period during 100,000 years, the Earth is farther away from the sun, therefore the atmosphere is a bit cooler, therefore you have the Ice Age. That's the big explanation in conventional circles for the cause of the Ice Age. But we've shown it could not be colder temperatures. what mainstream scientists say is the cause is hydrologically impossible. Therefore, we have to look at another mechanism for warmer ocean waters. And warmer ocean water, and conventional scientists don't say it was warmer ocean waters, but we've shown, once again, according to Hydrology 101, it had to have been warmer ocean waters. So therefore, we need to look at what caused the warmer ocean waters. And that's where we need to look into some ancient legends. The Hebrew legend, the fountains of the deep, to cause much of the water for the deluge. Ancient Teutonic legends of water and steam hissing through cracks in the earth as a global deluge enveloped the earth. We need to look at these ancient legends and ancient literatures and see if there's any merit in them. Because we have shown scientifically that it was geothermal heat from below.
So conventional science is looking forward to another ice age.
Yeah. When the Milankovitch cycle, when we cool down a little bit again, we're supposed to get another ice age.
Okay. Tell me just a bit with the timeline then. The geothermal activity caused, according to the PT, the ice age. Where's the flood come in, or is that the flood that we're...
Well, at the close of the flood years, the continents thickened, the ocean basin sank, and the deluge water slid off the thickening continents to the deepening ocean basins for the reason I discussed previously. And that post-deluge water that had slid off the continents of the deepening ocean basins was warmer. Creation scientists estimate it would have been on average about 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Currently, the average temperature of the ocean is about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. But creation scientists, hydrologists, anybody who runs the numbers will say that for that type of dense cloud cover for an ice age, that would have come from temperatures about 80 degrees Fahrenheit for the post-deluge ocean, or whatever that geothermal influx was that caused those warmer ocean water to be about 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And then according to common diffusion calculations, it would have taken about 800 years for that to cool down to about 50 degrees Fahrenheit on average, which it is today, which was at about 1500 BC. So you count those 800 years back, that puts this geothermal influx event from below at right around 2400 BC, which is right in the Genesis time frame. In India, to make the point that the ice age, end of the ice age sea level rise is not the same legends, are not the same legends about the global deluge. This is the point, in fact, that in India, they have a legend about Manu and the 7 rishis, 8 people, just like Genesis, writing out a clearly global catastrophe. But then they have other legends of, for instance, the kingdom of Kumari Kandam off the tip of India being submerged when the ice age ended. It rose a little bit. The Pandyan king Nedion was able to retreat a bit inland and defeat some people and set up a new kingdom. Now that's clearly different from a global deluge of Manu and the 7 rishis with 8 people and the seed of all the created things surviving, versus from the same country, the same India people speaking about a different deluge, merely the sea level rise at the end of the ice age. They're two different things, but some of the New Age types say that the legends about Noah's flood and all that is regarding the sea level rise at the end of the ice age, but clearly there are two different events.
Okay, this may be getting into the second show, but outside of legends, is there geologic evidence of a global?
Oh, the whole geologic column is evidence of it. Vast flat-lying sedimentary layers, often stacked like pancakes with billions of creatures entombed therein, 99% of which are marine creatures. According to today's processes, supposedly those rocks that I just described will eventually result from sedimentation at deltas, at river mouths today. Now, how are sedimentary deltas going to become lithified and become limestone in the middle of the continent? Outside of the legends, the 500 people group legends of the global encompassing flood, outside of those hearsay legends from ancestors, generation to generation, is there any geological evidence for this global deluge? Well, yes, obviously, I can say obviously, I've studied it, because we have vast lying sedimentary layers that are stacked like pancakes on the continents with billions of creatures entombed therein, 99% of which are marine creatures, creatures from the ocean, simple snails, clams, fish, animals that you'd expect to be entombed first during the progression of sedimentary deposition up on the continents. Now, how you need water up on the continents to explain vast sedimentary layers up on the continents. So water was up on the continents and covering the continents to create vast sedimentary layers that cover the continents. That bespeaks water up on the continents in one watery cataclysm, not a uniformitarian geology, which according to the conventional scientists proposes that the deltas of today, where sediments are building up at river deltas, at the mouths of rivers, according to the conventional scheme, those eventually will become shales and sandstones in Nebraska. Now that doesn't cut it. You know, sediment is building up there, but how do you get vast sedimentary layers covering Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Illinois in one vast sheet with billions of creatures entombed therein? That's not uniformitarianism. That is a global cataclysm with the water up on the continents. And incidentally, the flood of this deluge did not cover the current high mountains, because the mountains rose at the close of the flood year, as evidenced by the lack of radial tension cracks in the now folded sedimentary layers in the mountains, which proves that those layers were still wet and soft when the uplift and folding of the mountains occurred, which proves that it was at the close or after the flood year. And also, 3/4 of the basalt rocks, the lava rocks on the continents, are pillow basalts. And pillow basalts look like a stack of pillows. They're kind of rounded, and they are that way because they were extruded into water. They were extruded from the bowels of the earth into water on the continents. So once again, extrusion into water that was up on the continents. Now that's a deluge. That is not uniformitarian geology. You know, the people who have discovered and photographed these megaliths are small-time operators. There are people like Graham Hancock who had a hunch and read these rumors and these legends about submerged kingdoms like Mu, Rama, which is Kamari Kandam, and he acted upon them. He said, well, there must be city-states down there, megaliths. He acted on it and searched and found and photographed, a small-time operator. He broke the ice on this. He has showed megalithic sites in 3 or 4 parts of the world, and no major universities or research organizations with the big bucks have followed up to document this stuff in greater detail. Now, why this is, you may ask, you may have your opinion. My opinion is that they are of 2000 BC vintage on the seafloor. Therefore, the Ice Age ended after that, and the conventional do not want to deal with that implication. And because they don't want to deal with that implication, they say, well, block faulting. The coastline dropped 200 feet to cause these to become submerged megaliths. Well, as I've said previously, and I say in my book, Ice Age Civilizations, there is no evidence of horse or gravens, which are block faulting features. That should be evident in the hillsides, in the coastal, none. No evidence of 200 feet of block faulting, and on top of that, you think that might have been a legendary occurrence? Block faulting was not a legendary occurrence, but a slow rise in sea level to engulf city-states was a legendary occurrence. And therefore, we need to ask the status quo in the scientific community, why aren't you investigating these things? Is it because they do look like they're from 2000 BC, or is it for another reason? Let's find out. Yes, you know, conventional scientists date some of the megalithic structures, like at Catalhayuk in southern Turkey, the ancient Hittite, they would say the precursor to the Hittite nation. There's megalithic cities there, old relic cities, that some remnants of it were carbon dated to be 8000 BC, or 9000 BC, and therefore they will say that, well, Jim, megalithic building really began at 8000 BC in its rudimentary form. Leading up to the 3000 BC, according to these carbon-14 dates. Well, during the Ice Age, volcanoes were going off, belching carbon-12 into the atmosphere, and within carbon dioxide, effluence from volcanoes. Thousands of them during the Ice Age. Conventionals agree with this. So that carbon-12 that was being vented in the atmosphere diluted the amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere. Therefore, creatures that died and samples came from that time show greatly exaggerated ages because the carbon-14 was diluted by the carbon-12 from the volcanoes. Additionally, The mainstreamers will say, well, this date doesn't this carbon-14 date does not agree with our preconceived notion as to how old the sample should be, so they'll throw it out and they'll make up a reason why it's really a bad sample. But you see, going in, they thought it was a good sample, not a flawed sample. But when the result comes in, oh, it must be a flawed sample, and we'll find out a reason why. But it wasn't before they got the result. So it's kind of a rigged game. That warmer water came from somewhere that wasn't atmospheric, so you figure it out. And I bet I will whisper onto the camera, fountains of the deep. Genesis, fountains of the deep. Through the mid-oceanic ridges, that's where all that hot water, 70% of magma by weight is water. So when that, you've seen lava flows, all that steam, 70% by weight is water. So when the water and magma vented forth through the mid-oceanic ridges that look like the seam on a baseball in the oceanic floor, they rapidly separated those plates during the Noah's flood. North and South America moved rapidly away from Europe and Asia. They fit together nicely like a jigsaw puzzle. But during the flood, they moved away rapidly. Water and steam and basalt through the mid-oceanic ridges. New ocean bottom as the continent spread. 70% of that was water. So that is the main source of the water for Noah's flood. And the pre-flood continents were, say, only a mile high, and the pre-Noahic flood oceans were, say, only a mile deep. And the sea level only had to double to cover the continents, covered it, laid on all that sediments, mountain rose at the close of the flood year. As the continents thickened at the close of the flood year, ocean basin sank because the new ocean bottom was that lava that had replaced the spreading oceanic crust. And when that lava cooled and got denser, it sank into the vacated voids beneath it where the water and magma had come from. So the ocean bottom sank, the continents thickened, water slid right off into our current ocean basins.
My name is John Major Jenkins, and I am an independent Mayan scholar, author of Maya Cosmogenesis 2012. My speciality is the study of Mayan cosmology and calendar science, and this would incorporate studies of Mayan science and religion. And I've been doing this research for some 20 years, and more particularly, I've been very interested in the 2012 end date of the Mayan calendar.
Okay, now tell us how then the Olmecs fit into this study of yours.
Mm-hmm. In Mesoamerica, the Olmec people were the people that preceded the Maya. And the Olmec people were the culture that started to really be interested in the stars. And some 4,000 years ago, there are Olmec cities that are being built, and they're aligned in specific ways to, say, the Big Dipper. So we know that the Olmec were very, very interested in the stars.
Okay, so now what we talked about before is where did these civilizations get their knowledge from? Was it something shared with the ancient Egyptians or Babylonian, Phoenicians?
Mm-hmm. The ancient people of Mesoamerica, they share certain common traditions that we see around the globe, like, for example, temple building. My interpretation of this is that certainly there may have been transatlantic and trans-Pacific voyages going on. In fact, the entire globe might have been connected by these ancient mariners. What I like to point out is sort of a different perspective on this, is that these cultures were shamanistic. All of these cultures around the globe were shamanistic. It was a very, very different way than from modern science to come to an understanding of the universe. So all of these cultures were engaging in shamanistic practices to connect up into the transcendent wisdom. So even though they were located in different parts of the globe, they were all connecting into the same fount of knowledge. Ancient cultures around the globe were very astute sky watchers, more so than we give them credit for today. And they were aware of the cycles of the sun and the moon, and they paid very careful attention to the seasons and the differences in the sky, like, for example, the planets move differently than the stars. So it's very clear that many of these ancient cultures became aware of the slow shifting of the stars in relation to the seasons. This is precession, the precession of the equinoxes. There is an emerging model of Earth harmonics and how the ancients perceived the Earth. They were not only astute sky watchers, but they were what we might call surveyors of the Earth. They were mappers. And so they would map out the Earth. They were interested in these kinds of things. They were interested in their environment. So what we have is many sacred sites around the world that are located on specific meridians, specific latitudes and longitudes, and they seem to be placed in harmonic relationship with each other. This is a very, very interesting thing, and it seems to be beyond coincidence. Now, the way that I think that this was relevant is that what this seems to point to, and we're not real clear on what this is all about, but what it seems to point to is an ancient harmonic grid science, like a lost science of harmonics in which perhaps widely disparate cultures were communicating with each other, or they were drawing energy out of the Earth harmonic grid. In the archaeological record, there's been recent discoveries that indicate that there were connections between, for example, the Phoenicians and South America. For example, there were Roman trading vessels found in the mouth of the Amazon. There's actually a lot of evidence that there were contacts going on around the world. Now, that's very interesting. The Maya, however, seem to have developed some very original perspectives on these things. For example, their long count calendar. There's no precedent for this this calendar tradition, its mechanics, and how it really operates. There's no precedent for this anywhere else in the world. So it's reasonable to suspect that the Maya developed the long count tradition, which is the 2012 calendar, on their own. There's similarities between the Mayan pyramids and the Egyptian pyramids in the general intent of the builders of those pyramids. They were intending these pyramids to mirror the sky, and they were encoding the proportions and the cycles that they see in the sky into the pyramid structure. So in these ancient shamanistic societies, they had similar goals. The ancient people of Mesoamerica, they share certain common traditions that we see around the globe, like, for example, temple building. My interpretation of this is that certainly there may have been transatlantic and transpacific voyages going on. In fact, the entire globe might have been connected by these ancient mariners. What I like to point out is sort of a different perspective on this, is that these cultures were shamanistic. All of these cultures around the globe were shamanistic. It was a very, very different way than from modern science to come to an understanding of the universe. So all of these cultures were engaging in shamanistic practices to connect up into the transcendent wisdom. So even though they were located in different parts of the globe, they were all connecting into the same fount of knowledge. Okay. If we cast back into the ancient past to try to come back into contact with wisdom, well, that's possibly one way to do it. The ancient cultures were seemingly in contact with this amazing universal wisdom. Well, the thing about universal wisdom is that it's everywhere at all times. The problem with the modern world is that our eyes are closed to the wisdom. But the thing is that today, in our world, we ourselves can open up our eyes to this cosmic wisdom.
How you'd like to be identified in the documentary?
I would like to be identified as Dr. Maxine Asher, president, American World University International.
Okay. Now, tell me what made you first think that the story of a submerged city might be true?
In 1959, I walked into the classroom of Dr. Julian Nava, who later became the United States ambassador to Mexico under Jimmy Carter. He was teaching at Cal State Northridge. On the board were two words, Atlantis and Moira. He said, "Class, Moira means fate in Greek, and Atlantis was a submerged civilization. I believe it is someone's fate to find Atlantis." Coming from a man who had a PhD from Harvard, chills went through my body, and I knew then that there was truth to the story.
Okay. So describe your journey, your trek, all the trials and tribulations until you ultimately found Atlantis.
I had many trials and tribulations on the path to Atlantis. It was not a smooth path. It was a difficult one. First of all, nobody believed Atlantis was real. I made 50 trips to Spain, that's 50 overseas trips, in search of Atlantis, following Plato's story of Atlantis in his dialogues, the Timaeus and Critias. Unfortunately, nobody knew anything about Atlantis at that time, and I relied on cab drivers and the most inconsequential kinds of sources of information to find out about Atlantis. But ultimately I realized Plato was right, and I had to go to Cadiz, Spain, to find Atlantis.
Okay, so tell me, where did you actually find it?
After speaking to Francisco Salazar, Paco, a very important diver in Spain, and spending time with him, he said to me, "Maxine, there are 4 submerged cities off the coast of Spain. I've read about Atlantis, Maxine, and I believe one of them is Atlantis, but we need to do some more exploring." And after many, many years, Paco was able to get photographs of this civilization, which we are absolutely confident, by water level and location, is Atlantis.
Okay, so describe, you just mentioned photos, describe what you felt when you first saw the photos and footage.
I was terribly excited because it's very hard to get photos in the Atlantic Ocean. The sand covers up everything before you can get the photo, and the ruins were embedded in blocks of clamshells that had frozen together, and Paco had to hack them apart. But when I finally saw the photos, we had a city about 2.5 miles wide by 2.5 miles long. We could see fireplaces, we could see remnants of buildings, we could see pottery, all sorts of things, 120 feet down on the continental shelf.
That's fantastic. Now, describe what the civilization was like back in those days, when it was flourishing.
It's my hunch, and you have to go on a hunch, that the Atlanteans were typical Mediterranean people. If you look at ancient Crete, you look at ancient Cyprus, all of the civilizations in the Mediterranean, they're all reflections of Atlantis. These were Mediterranean-style people. And they, according to the scientists, don't really know about them, but the psychics, like Edgar Cayce, tell us that they were very advanced, and in fact, they had a giant crystal that they used for power. Now, originally, we thought that was not true, that was something made up, until I discovered that there were pieces of shattered crystal very close to where we found our photographs that had come from a great cataclysm. In 2004, I got a call from Spain. It said, "Maxine, the BBC has just announced that satellite photos of Atlantis have been discovered." When I saw the BBC article, I realized, my goodness, these photos were only 20 or 30 miles from where we got our undersea photos. And so I went to Spain immediately to do some television work, and I got a copy of the satellite photo, which was written up in Antiquity magazine, and a lot of work on this was done by Professor Cooney in Germany, and lo and behold, the satellite photos reflected Plato's story and our photos. So we got a lot of corroboration for what we were working on.
Okay, that's great. Now, what do you think the climate was like back then when they were flourishing?
I believe the climate in those days, 9600 BC, maybe a little earlier, was very similar to today. It was global warming. Even geologists will tell you that, climatologists will tell you that. And so the ice began melting at the poles, and little by little there's evidence that water was drifting down into Europe in big puddles. Well, just as you defrost a refrigerator, it drip, 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 and suddenly there was a huge break. And everything came tumbling in at once. Look at the Bible. It rained for 40 days and 40 nights, and everything was flooded. Today, we still have evidence of the flood in Spain. We have 35 miles of water where you cannot go from Portugal through to Cadiz because of an area called the Marismas, which is still evidence of that great flood. So look at what is happening today. Places like the Maldive Islands are going to go underwater. Look at the piece of ice that broke off from the South Pole. We're in a global warming. They were in a global warming too.
Okay. Now, describe the seafaring abilities of that civilization.
We have a hunch that the Atlanteans were able to navigate the seas. Remember, Atlantis at one point was a series of islands which spanned the entire Atlantic Ocean at one time. And the story of how they got up there has to do with the platelets at the bottom of the ocean. They were able to go from island to island by boat. How do we know this? We have great similarities between Mexico and Egypt. You turn an Egyptian sideways, he looks like a Mayan Indian. You have the same pyramids. You have commonalities in the languages. There are Mayan characters in the Egyptian language. So how did that happen? Well, they had to have a way to get across. We don't know how they navigated the waters because obviously that was long before compasses and other things were invented. A lot of it was done by experimentation, by hunch, by... the other day there was a show on one of the channels that showed that Noah's Ark, when it took off, Noah didn't even know where he was. He was surrounded by water, but suddenly he ended up, believe it or not, and the Ark is connected with this. The Ark ended up in what is now the country of Bahrain, according to this show, but Noah was at a loss to know where he was for a long period of time. That's probably true. You know, you remember there was a mistake. Columbus thought he was finding America, and he found Santo Domingo. So we don't know. We think they guessed a lot, yeah.
Okay. Could you describe the time frame for the sea level rise that engulfed Atlantis?
Yes. We have evidence from cores taken from the ice in the poles. They measured the different sea levels, and I have this all scientifically documented in my new book, The Scientific Evidence for the Existence of Atlantis, that those cores showed that there was a 200-foot rise in sea level all over the Atlantic Ocean in 9600 BC. Look at the flood stories. The Navajos have flood stories. The Mayans have flood stories. There were floods everywhere. Big rise in sea level, 9600 BC. Yep.
Okay. Do you know, like, how quickly it rose?
The seas rose quickly because of the fast ice melt. There's a book called Worlds in Upheaval. Emanuel Velikovsky wrote about catastrophes. And this particular catastrophe, the seas rose fast. The Bible says 40 days and 40 nights, it suddenly. But we know they rose very fast. And people rushed to make arks. We have evidence at Gibraltar near Cadiz of people escaping a great flood in boats, petroglyphs. So, but they didn't escape. Only 1% of all the people probably escaped that flood.
Okay. Now, do you know or have any idea how those ancient civilizations first got their knowledge to build their city and flourish and explore other islands?
Well, we don't know how the ancients got their knowledge, but we do know from our studies now of the intuitive right side of the brain, and I've done a lot of that in the schools, that the people had this creative ability. It is said that all the knowledge of the universe is right around us all the time, only our minds aren't trained to receive it. We need a long-distance radio in the brain. Well, the ancients weren't cluttered up with computers and all sorts of physical things, and so they were able to draw knowledge, in my opinion, to themselves. An example would be the Great Pyramids of Egypt, and they did remarkable things. Today, I think we've blotted out that side of the brain, and we need to restore it again. We're out of balance.
Okay, well, that's great. Okay, now briefly discuss the status of Atlantis in the context of many other sites worldwide that are now underwater, such as those found off Malta, Egypt, Lebanon, India, Japan. Are there other cities still to be found underwater?
Yes, there certainly are other cities to be found underwater, and we have evidence of that every day. In fact, a city was found recently in the Black Sea that was 8,000 years old. Now, the most important thing is that there's a book called Atlantis, Mother of Empires. And I think that's Stacy Judd is the author, I'm not sure. But in any case, you see similarities among the cultures, similarities in Malta, similarities between Ireland and Wales, similarities between the Basque language and the Irish language, in their music. It's all sorts of commonalities in these cultures that were influenced by Atlantis. So Atlantis influenced certainly all of the Mediterranean cultures, certainly those on the other side of the ocean. We talked about that earlier. Atlantis was the mother in empires. It was the first truly civilized place in the ancient world, but it was demolished. And I'd like to mention that between Atlantis and the time Egypt started, around 5000 BC, there were many upheavals, many cataclysms. They got the knowledge, they lost it. They got it and they lost it. And so it didn't get solidified until Egypt started. Yeah. Well, we know there were civilizations certainly off the coast of Egypt, Alexandria. We know that there were civilizations, certainly we've seen underwater cities off Malta, off Crete, off Ireland. There was a place called St. Brendan's Island that was on earlier map that is no longer there. A good book is Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings by Charles Hapgood. Shows you where the land was, and it's not there anymore. Well, where did it go? It's obviously underwater. So everywhere in the world, the whole history of the world lies underwater. If we'd get off the space shot for 2 years and use the money for underwater research, well, the whole history of the world, our origins would be discovered, in my opinion. You asked me about the Great Pyramid of Egypt and where did the technology come from where they were able to build a pyramid in perfect dimension without any mortar between the bricks, that they were able to form acoustical sounds in the pyramids. How do I know? I was there. I was in every chamber of the pyramid. I went with Paul Horn, who made a flute concert in the pyramid. We did biofeedback in the pyramid to see what kind of properties it has, and they're huge. And so I think your question to me was, how did they get this knowledge? Well, if you read Peter Tompkins' book, Secrets of the Great Pyramid, his thought is that it was just known to them. They just knew how to do it, because the Great Pyramid parallels astronomy. In other words, it has an astronomical alignment that's absolutely perfect. And so, obviously, they didn't know about astronomy in those days, so they must have experimented till they got it right. You have another area in the world, Newgrange, Caves of Newgrange in Ireland, where the sun shines through on a certain day every year. They knew to build the cave just so they picked up the sunlight at that time. Stonehenge, too, in England, has the same properties. So the ancients in many places knew how to align things astronomically for their benefit.
Okay, now then following up on that, could the ancients have developed advanced maps and used devices like our current sextant to navigate the world with this knowledge?
Yes, I think the ancients had some marvelous maps. I referred earlier to Hapgood's book, Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings. They were remarkable maps, considering the state of cartography in those days. We don't know how they knew it, except maybe from traversing the islands they figured it out. As far as navigational instruments, those were not in place until the Middle Ages, so they didn't have those. But they must have had some makeshift. I think they used the winds a lot to determine things when they were out, the directions of the winds. I'm not a sailor, unfortunately, but my hunch is they simply knew.
Okay.
And I want to say one more thing. From teaching school, children would come up with things that were never in the books. And I would say to this child, Johnny, how did you know that? I don't know, Dr. Asher. I just knew. So kids have that intuitive knowing as well. Was there a connection between Atlantis and all of these other ancient civilizations around the world? Probably, but not constantly. There was communication, but there was disruption, either due to other catastrophes, or the fact that nobody was traveling during those periods. But obviously, if we look at the pyramid at Tikal in Guatemala, and we look at the pyramids in Egypt, we see tremendous similarities. Tikal is a lot like the pyramid at Saqqara in Egypt. As I said, there are 25 Egyptian characters in the Mayan alphabet. How in the world did they get there? So, yes, they were in touch. And I also visited with the Navajo Indians. And the Navajo Indians in our country have a flood story. And they have a language that is unusual. During World War II, they had the Navajo code talkers. But that language, too, is related to certain ancient languages. I worked a lot with Cyrus Gordon from Brandeis University. He wrote a book called Riddles in History, where you get into all these connections between words. If you trace words, you trace the history of the world. The oldest sounds in the world are ash, ava, ag, and those can be found in certain places, and that's how you can tell the routes that civilization took. That's a whole other subject, linguistics. Fascinated by it.
Okay. Now, go into a little bit, describe how the southern Spanish town of Cadiz got its name.
Well, I was absolutely amazed. Of course, I just love Cadiz. And I started asking people, and then they said, oh, the old name for Cadiz was Gadis. And I said, okay. And they said, and the other name was Kaddish. I go, wait a minute. Kaddish is the prayer for the dead in the Jewish religion. Listen to this. Kaddish, Gadis, Kaddish. The sound is the same, not the spelling. Well, my question to myself was, if everybody died at Gibraltar, which we believe they did, that's right near Cadiz, is that why Kaddish is the prayer for the dead? And there's another thing. A lot of the cities that were in the Holy Land were first in Spain. We have proof that Tarshish was Tartessus of Spain and later was renamed in the Holy Land. The people went across after the flood. So I spent a lot of time on phonetics, acoustical phonetics, to figure out where people came from by the sounds and the words. It's fascinating. The advanced knowledge that the ancients had, according to what I understand, was placed in the libraries at Alexandria in Egypt. But the libraries were destroyed in 396 AD and also in another time. So we lost them. When the libraries at Alexandria were destroyed, we lost a great deal of that knowledge. Some of the greatest ladies in the world, Queen Sophia of Greece, and some people from the Middle East, they were going to rebuild the libraries at Alexandria in order to see if they could restore some of the ancient knowledge in our time.
Precession of the equinox is the movement of the stars over vast periods of time. And you can notice that by looking due east on the equinox. Astronomers have noticed that a different constellation will come into view. So if Aquarius is dawning at the spring equinox right now, Pisces has been there for the last 2,000 years. Before that was Aries, etc. And so it takes about 24 to 26,000 years to actually see all the 12 zodiacs along the ecliptic pass through the equinox. The ancient Greeks had believed in a heliocentric system. Sun in the center, planets go around it. Aristarchus of Samos had talked about this, Philios, Archimedes. That knowledge was lost as we went into the Dark Ages. And there things stood with the Catholic Church and Ptolemy supporting this geocentric view. And it wasn't until Copernicus came along in 1543 when we sort of got back to a heliocentric view. And so he said the Earth has three motions. It spins on its axis, and that's why we see the sun appearing to go around the Earth, but it's caused by the Earth spinning. And the Earth goes around the sun, and that causes the seasons. And he needed a third motion to explain the precession of the equinox. So he said the Earth wobbled. I really don't think precession is a mapping the globe issue. It's a device that the ancients used to sort of keep time where we are in this great cycle. So you have the age of Taurus, and you find a lot of bull icons, in artifacts of that era. Same thing with the age of Aries, etc. So that wasn't really the purpose of precession. But to kind of get back to the science point, Copernicus again had said that precession of the equinox is caused by the wobbling Earth. Newton then came along and said, well, if the Earth wobbles, it must be due to the forces of the moon and the sun. So we kind of came up with this lunisolar theory. And that's sort of the theory that's in existence now. However, we've found evidence at the Binary Research Institute that the Earth's axis does not wobble relative to objects within the solar system. Sun, moon, Venus. It only appears to wobble relative to objects outside the solar system, about 50 arc seconds per year. Thus, we think the reason for the precession of the equinox is the whole solar system is curving through space, not just an independently wobbling Earth. All around the world, we find evidence of advanced cultures in the very distant past. And those cultures decline. So in the Indus Valley, we have Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, had very complex cities, indoor plumbing, sewage systems, etc. And not only do those cities go away, but those technologies sort of disappear around the rest of the world. Ancient Mesopotamia was much the same, and not only did they have those technologies, but we've found great knowledge of astronomy. We've found that they have trepanation devices. These are devices used for brain surgery, and they've found skulls with perfect little circles in them that healed up. And yet all that knowledge goes away as Sumer, Akkad, Babylon just go to dust. And of course the whole Mediterranean cultures went away with Egypt declining, Greece, Rome, and finally this Dark Age. And Western science tends to believe that, well, that just happened here in the West, but if you look at the archaeological record closely, it appears that it also happened in China and the Americas. So civilization collapses, and the question is, why do we have this worldwide collapse? And the ancients would tell us that it has something to do with precession. They had a myth that was prevalent throughout the world that life moved in cycles, with a golden age at one end and a dark age at the other. And they knew that they were in a declining age. As a matter of fact, Stefan Mahl, one of the foremost Syrianologists, has been interpreting some of these cuneiform clay tablets and found that they seem to revere the past and refer to it as a high time, and they fear and dread the future. The Greeks said the same thing. So they knew they were declining, and it has something to do with precession. How they knew these things, we don't know. That's the big mystery that we're all working on, not just here at Binary Research Institute, but Graham Hancock, John West, and all these independent researchers all around the world that have, sort of come together to spontaneously collaborate and write books on this subject. And so some theories are that there was a mother culture, such as Atlantis, and that's where the knowledge came from. Others, like Sitchin, say, well, no, the Earth was hunter-gatherers for millions of years, and then aliens came, and that gave the knowledge. I tend to believe the Greek, the story of the Great Year, that it's cyclical, that knowledge ebbs and flows like the celestial cycles, day and night, the seasons. And it's caused indirectly by this great year movement that we see as the precession of the equinox. They seem to be at their height near the beginning of the archaeological record, and they decline, and they lose the ability to build pyramids completely, and then the civilization pretty much goes away and buried under the sands. And this has happened all over the world. And so why does this knowledge go away? And we think that it has to do with the way the Earth is affected as it goes through various cycles. For example, as the Earth spins on its axis, you have the cycles of day and night, increasing light and darkness. As the Earth goes around the sun, it causes the seasons, and plants spring out of the ground, bears hibernate, fish spawn, etc. It affects all life. So too, if there is a third motion, if our sun is indeed going around another star, as we postulate, then you would have the same electromagnetic effect interacting with the Earth, the magnetosphere, ionosphere, and we believe indirectly consciousness. But let me just try to clarify one point. I think, if we're looking for evidence of cycles, we tend to see things through our own lens of what is a modern age. So we think that cell phones and computers and big buildings are the sign of a high age, because that's what we've developed in the last 50 years, 100 years. And I believe that the ancients have a much different view of what an advanced culture is. Indeed, I would think we would perceive it more as a hunter-gatherer style, whereas they would view living in closer attunement with nature as a beneficial thing. And so I don't know that we're going to find, all this technology and big buildings and stuff. I think ancient man was much wiser than that. I don't think he was mucking up the earth. The Great Pyramid is an amazing artifact of a higher culture. It's made of 2.5 to 3 million blocks of stone. The smaller ones are several tons, and the larger ones are dozens of tons. I think there's one that's about 70 tons in the king's chamber. And supposedly it was built during Khufu's reign, a period of 20 to 30 years, something like that. And it just is inconceivable how you could put that many large stones into place in that period of time. Because if you think about it nowadays, you're trying to move a 50-ton stone, that's you'll plan that for several weeks and then get your whole crew together to move one stone. Here we are in the year 2005, 2006, trying to look back and interpret what the ancients knew. And we tend to filter that information, consciously or not, through our own biases, our own context. And the principal context we use is that evolution is fairly linear, that we went from caveman to modern man, and a few bumps along the way, but we're progressing. We should be much better now than we were, and therefore ancient man is primitive. However, if you use the ancient context that life is cyclical, just as the day and the seasons are cyclical, then if you go back far enough, actually prior to about 1500 BC, you would expect to start to see things that reflect a higher consciousness. And so it presents a whole different way to look at the archaeological record. There's some ruins in Turkey that go back to 9,000 or 10,000 years, 50-ton poles, shafts. They appear to be the residue of a great building, and they're carved, and it's completely out of context with the notion that we all learned in school that anything prior to 5,000 years ago was just hunter-gatherer. And so they're finding more and more of this, but it's buried, it's deep. The ancient structures in Egypt tend to be the lowest down, whereas the new ones are 20 to 40 feet above current levels. Personally, I was looking for an answer to history. We were taught that it was linear. The ancients taught that it was cyclical. All the evidence I see is that you had these great cultures all around the world that declined into a dark age, and now we're going back up. So I was trying to find some reason for a cyclical record. And I found several books that made reference to a possible dual star or dual suns, and found this also in the myth and folklore. And so began a search in earnest about 5 years ago when I formed the Binary Research Institute to really zero in, could our sun have a companion star? And we've hired mathematicians, astrophysicists, consulted with them, talked quite a bit over the internet, and it turns out that about 80% of all stars are either in binary or multiple systems. So, why wouldn't our own sun also have a partner if that's the majority? And if so, could that produce the phenomenon that we call the precession of the equinox? Again, all these myths and folklore are tied to the precession of the equinox. And so we really began to examine the current theory of precession, and found out that there's some big problems with it. One is that the Earth's axis does not appear to wobble relative to local objects, sun, moon, Venus, etc., whereas it clearly wobbles relative to the distant stars, quasars, that we measure against. And the only way we can see that phenomena happening is if the whole solar system itself is curving through space. And the only reason the solar system would curve through space is if it's going around another very large mass, meaning we're in a binary star system.
What is the Milankovitch cycle, and could that have been the cause of an ice age?
Milankovitch was a geophysicist, I think a good 100 years ago, I don't remember for certain, who speculated that changes in the orbit of the Earth or in the inclination of the axis of the Earth might have an effect on the climate of the Earth, and in particular might cause ice ages. He was viewed as a crank in his day. No one expected that would be a legitimate argument. And then about the same time that seafloor spreading was demonstrated to cause continental drift, so in the 60s, the 1960s, people found evidence that in fact there were cycles in the ice ages that corresponded to the Milankovitch cycles. There's three main cycles. The ellipticity of the orbit of the Earth varies on about a 100,000-year cycle, so it gets more circular and then it gets more elongated. The inclination of the axis changes its time it changes the precession, and so you get different amounts of sunlight at different times of year and different times of the cycle, different periods of the cycle. Nowadays, it's fairly generally accepted that there's some relationship between these cycles, the Milankovitch cycles, and ice ages. It hasn't been proven, so far as I know. In order to prove this, you would have to have a realistic model of the Earth's climate, a mathematical model that could reproduce the climate correctly, which would also, if you gave it the appropriate changes in solar input, reproduce the ice ages. And to the best of my knowledge, that hasn't been done yet. The models, it's an extremely difficult problem to model the full climate system, and I do expect that eventually they'll manage this. The coincidence between the timing of the ice ages and the Milankovitch cycles is pretty convincing. But I would say it's still a theory, it's not a fact, it's not a demonstrated fact. There's a factor that we always have to consider when you think about the history of civilization, which is that when you get more and more people in an area, they tend to use up things that make an area temperate, like trees and water. And so you'll find that areas where people have lived for a long time often become desert. It's desertification referred to. And there's some involvement of civilization. If you cut down all the trees and you don't let more grow, and if the soil erodes, you get less plant cover. Plant cover holds moisture, and so places become more arid simply because people live there. That's on a we I think know a little bit about how to prevent that nowadays, and you don't see it quite as readily, but we think that in the Fertile Crescent in Samaria and in India and in Egypt, it's likely that that did play some role. It's also likely that the fact that 10,000 or say 20,000 years ago we were in the depth of a cold period, an ice age, meant that the storm tracks that occur in the winter in the northern hemisphere were further south than they are now. And so those storms would bring rainfall to northern Africa, and there is some evidence that, for example, the Sahara Desert was more moist, had running streams and rivers, had lakes that were larger, had wildlife that was consistent with a more humid environment. And it's pretty reasonable to guess that that was also the case in eastern Africa, where Egypt is. Egypt is such an unusual situation with the Nile and its regular floods that it may not be a perfectly safe conclusion to draw. But northern Africa in general does seem to have been wetter, more humid, probably cooler than it is in the present day. The most recent glacial epoch seemed to peak about 18,000 years ago. And the warmest period since then was about 8,000 years ago. So a reasonable statement would be that it ended between those two times, between 18,000 and 8,000 years ago. You could also argue that it hasn't ever completely ended because we do have ice caps now. And so by some reasonable definitions, we're still in an ice age. However, clearly we're not anywhere near the cold conditions we were 18,000 years ago. The meltdown took place over that 10,000 year period. I believe, if I remember correctly, since that climatic optimum 8,000 years ago, it's been the ice caps have been relatively stable. We haven't had big advances or decreases. There's been some change, but it's been sort of level since then. It wasn't a uniform meltdown. It was the sort of thing where it was 18,000 years ago, it was very cold and very extensive ice. 15,000 years ago, I think it was still pretty similar. And by 12,000, it was melting quickly. And I guess I do remember that the North American ice cap, for example, didn't fully melt away until even after the climatic optimum. So we still had ice caps in Labrador and northern Canada even after that 8,000 year ago period. We know from observations in the last 30 or 40 years that some volcanic eruptions have a fairly significant effect on the climate over a several year time scale. So eruptions like El Chichon and Pinatubo, which put a lot of sulfuric acid and particulates into the high atmosphere, into the stratosphere, where it stays for a long time, have an effect on the amount of sunlight that makes it to the Earth's surface. They act like a sunshade. And they tend to cool the summers. They don't cool the winters very much because in the winter there's not a lot of sun anyway, and so it's not as strong an effect. But you'll have cool summers after a big volcanic eruption. I don't know of any evidence that there were big volcanic eruptions, and by big I mean much bigger than Pinatubo or Chichon. I mean gigantic, the sort that created the Deccan spills in India, or there's some eruptions that are known to geologists to have been so enormous that it's thought they would have an effect on global climate that would last for hundreds or thousands of years. Nothing like that seemed to have occurred during the last 100,000 or million years. The biggest eruption that I've even heard reference to is one of the Yellowstone eruptions, and I've never heard anyone claim that they thought that had a big effect on the Ice Age timing. Well, sea level rose at the end of the Ice Age for the really simple, obvious reason that we had a lot of ice tied up in the ice caps on land. At the end of the Ice Age, they melted, and that ice turned into water and flowed down to the ocean. And so the water in the ocean rose, I believe, by a few hundred feet. 100 meters or more comes to mind. So you had things, for example, during the Ice Age, North America was connected to Eurasia across the Bering Straits. That was dry land, and that got flooded. England and Ireland were connected to Europe, and as the water rose, that got flooded. The Mediterranean Sea was dried out because the Straits of Gibraltar were closed off, and that got flooded. The Black Sea was flooded at some point. All these things happened as the sea level rose. Now there's another factor, which is that water expands when you warm it, and so if the water in the ocean became warmer by several degrees, it would expand and sea level would rise a bit because of that alone. We're actually seeing that now, but compared to the water that came from the ice caps melting, that was a very small effect then. Certainly this recent Ice Age, there's no evidence that ice and snow covered the whole planet. There is speculation there was a period in the past, much longer ago, where you had snowball Earth that's been referred to, the entire planet covered with ice and snow. But this more recent Ice Age, the last million or 10 million years, nothing like that has happened. As the ice caps expanded, they stopped at an area like in North America. Long Island is a terminal moraine. It's the edge of where the ice cap was. And you'll see the same sort of thing across, I believe, Pennsylvania and into the Midwest. So wherever the ice cap ended, you tend to see these sort of lumps of sand and gravel that got carried within the glaciers and dropped there as it melted. So we can actually tell fairly effectively where the edge of the Ice Age was, or the edge of the ice cap was. The animals would migrate, plants and animals. These things moved. It took thousands of years for them to advance hundreds of miles or even tens of miles in some cases. And so there was enough time for especially animals, but even plants could move to keep pace with their preferred climate zones. Now, in some cases, they would get trapped. I know of examples, I've heard of examples where, for example, a population of maybe squirrels would retreat. Instead of retreating, say during the warming, the ice caps melting, instead of retreating north, they would retreat up in, say, the Rockies or the Appalachians. And of course, they couldn't go terribly far because it only goes so far up. And they might die out if it got too warm, or they might be sort of trapped there. They couldn't leave the mountains they were in because in every direction it was too warm for them. So you get both plants and animals into that sort of situation. But for the most part, animals would migrate north or south, poleward or equatorward, to stay in their preferred climatic zone, both plants and animals. Now, large mammals are a little bit of a special case because most large mammals are quite adaptable and can move rapidly and didn't have, for example, they certainly wouldn't be trapped on a mountain range. If you get an elk like to live in relatively cold climates. If they retreated up a hill, so where it was cooler, and they found it got too warm, well, they'd set out and they'd go somewhere else, and enough would make it to the north that it would not be a problem. So large mammals would be reasonably safe in either case, but if their food sources changed enough, that might cause them significant trouble. Well, we don't really know what the cloud cover was during the ice ages, but if we did have more extensive cloud cover, certainly clouds tend to warm the surface, especially in cold regions. They tend to trap. Cold regions are cold partly because when the sun goes down, the Earth radiates heat out into space. So if you have cloud cover, especially low clouds, it acts like a blanket and it traps that heat and keeps the surface warmer than it would be otherwise. So that certainly would happen, but we don't really know. Nowadays, ice caps tend to be dry and clear areas. Antarctica has few clouds, and the Arctic in winter tends to be relatively clear. And so it gets colder, in fact, because of that. There's also, while there is an association between clouds and rainfall, it's not a perfect one. It doesn't always rain just because you have more cloud. Some cloudy areas, like Southern California, which can be pretty, especially if you go offshore, it can be pretty cloudy a lot of the year, but it's the sort of cloud cover, it's called stratocumulus, that really doesn't rain significantly. You may get a little drizzle, but it can be very, very dry. Some areas. It doesn't take a lot of snow to create the ice caps. It just takes snow that lasts through the summer. Antarctica is ice covered, snow covered, and has been for millions of years, but from what we can see now, it doesn't snow very much there at all. It's just that what snow falls stays. It doesn't melt. But the fact is, we don't know what the beginning of an ice age is. We really don't know how the ice caps, say, over North America begin to grow. And it's certainly possible that an argument was presented many years ago that suppose the Arctic Ocean melts. Instead of having permanent ice cover, you have open water. Well, then you would get more evaporation because ice doesn't evaporate anywhere near as much as water. And you would get more cloud, and you'd probably get more snowfall. And maybe an ice age begins with heavier snowfalls associated with open water. And it can't last forever, and it can't account for the entire growth of the ice cap, because before the ice cap was finished growing, the ocean would freeze over. Right. But maybe there's some role in the beginning. We absolutely have no idea what really happens at the beginning of a glacial expansion.
Okay, thank you. And just one more question. Can you explain the presence of elephants in Siberia and hippos in England during the Ice Age? And might these have been temperate zones?
No. Elephants are actually pretty well adapted to cold temperatures because they're large, and large animals retain heat better. And the elephants, the mammoths that were found in Siberia, were actually pretty heavily haired. They have lots of hair, lots of insulation, and so they're well adapted to cold temperatures. There's also speculation that they weren't there during the coldest part of the Ice Age, that they were there sort of during the interglacial periods, and when it got really cold, they would migrate south to get away from the actual glaciers. If you have the Ice Ages, the coldest periods are really identified by extensive ice caps, and that's completely inconsistent with having temperate zones. Now, the hippos is a different story. I don't actually know anything about hippos in England. They live in water. They spend virtually all of their time in water, and they eat aquatic plants, and so you have to have liquid water, but I have absolutely no idea what sort of temperature it would have to be. You have lots of marine mammals that live in very cold water, and so it's not immediately obvious they couldn't live in cold water. Hippos, they have lots of fat for insulation, but nowadays they don't seem to live in cold water, so maybe there's a connection, but out of my area, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Tell us a little bit about your background and how you heard about the underwater site.
I lived on Okinawa for a period of 7 years from the time of 1995 until 2002. At that time, I was on active duty in the Marine Corps, and I was also a underwater photography instructor and a professional scuba diving instructor. So I was really tuned into the scuba scene, if you will, of the Okinawan Islands. Okinawa's got a nice chain of islands stretching from southern Japan almost to Taiwan. And it was at about 1996 that the scuba scene, the folks in the know, started really chatting it up about this finding that was down on Yonaguni Island. Yonaguni Island is almost 1,200 miles south of Tokyo. It's about 400 miles south of Okinawa. It's really closest to Taiwan, where it's only about 135 miles east of Taiwan, just off the northeast corner. So we heard about it, and I thought, what a great adventure. Because I was an underwater photography instructor, I have also been a photojournalist, which I really enjoy a lot. I like to scuba dive. I love photography, and have certainly made it more than a passion as a profession. And I thought that it would be great to go down and cover this and then publish my findings from a trip to Yonaguni.
Describe where the Yonaguni site is.
The island of Yonaguni, like I say, is closer to Taiwan than it is to mainland Japan, significantly closer. 135 miles northeast of Taiwan is where the island of Yonaguni sets. That's about 350 miles south of Okinawa and about 1,200 miles south of Tokyo. So it's real close to Taiwan. The monuments are found on Iseki Point. Iseki Point is on the northeastern corner of that island.
Do you think the site is man-made or natural?
Well, I'll tell you, I went into this open-minded. I went into it as a photographer. I'm not a geologist. I'm not a specialist in these things. My first trip, I kept an open mind and photographed it. But as I developed the photos, as I worked with the photos, and I did more research on the articles that I was writing for publication in scuba diving magazines and things like that, I started to lean towards man-made. It just started to really stand out that this had to be touched by the hands of man. I'll describe this as you descend onto the monuments at Iseki Point. When you roll off the boat and you begin to descend, you descend into about 75 to 80 feet of water. It's very clear, very, very clear water. And the discoverer, Arataki, will take you to a certain point. And you're very disoriented. You've splashed into the water. There's a lot of current. The water's moving fast, and you're sounding as fast as you can to get to the bottom and equalize and get ready for the dive. And then you go through an opening. Now, this opening is through solid rock, and it's a square opening. And you scoot through this opening, and then you come out into a clearing. Now, the opening is much like a gate. Been described by one of the professors from the University of Ryukyu's, Professor Kimura, as a gasuku, Japanese for gate. So you go through this gate and you come into an opening, like a courtyard. And at that courtyard rises up this, I call it an obelisk. It's a large square column rising up from about 60 feet of water to about 20 feet, 15 feet of water. It's huge. It would weigh tons and tons and tons. It's that big. And it's just cutting away from this large hill of limestone. And this large hill is some 75 feet to about 15 feet. And that's where you first see the Iseki Point, the monuments, as they're called. So you've gone through this gate, you've come to a clearing, there's this huge obelisk. And then the dive master will have you turn to the right, and the current begins to pick up. And the current literally blows you around the side of these monuments. And around this corner that's when you start seeing the terraces. And they're 90-degree terraces, and they terrace up from the bottom up to about 15 feet under the surface of the water. And they're stair-stepped, plateau-like, almost looking like Mayan ruins. And it's dramatic. They're huge. It's wide open. It's so clear. Oh, and by the way, you're probably going about 2.5 to 3 knots in this uncontrolled push of current. So you're swimming around to get out of the current, and then you just want to hang on to something to catch your breath. And then you gently work your way across these flat spaces, flat with a 90-degree wall, and it terraces up. You can choose to go down or you can choose to go up. This is about 35 to 40 minutes into the dive. You've gone across the terraces. You've seen the things that are, to me, obviously man-made. I just can't see nature carving at right angles repeatedly like this. But then at the end of this, in a clearing, very wide open space, but it's at the very end, in about 45 to 50 feet of water, sets a round granite ball, 15 feet in diameter, 10 feet high, and this round granite ball sets on a square pedestal on a flat rock. And the round ball is obviously not contiguous to the square platform. And that was impressive to me. I would say that after photographing that for a morning, I pretty much went with the man-made theory. One of the things that always stood out to me was the lack of rubble. If it had been carved out by nature, I would have expected to see on these terraces debris, because it's coming up from about 90 feet of water, and it terraces up, and again, much like a Mayan ruin, but each terrace is clean. Each terrace has clean 90-degree angles as it comes up, and there's no rubble at the bottom, and there's no rubble on any of these flat terraces. At the top, in about 20 to, I'd say 15 feet of water, at the very top of what is referred to as the monuments, there's a small staircase carved out of little small stairs. Maybe the risers are like 6 to 8 inches each, and it goes up in a little hallway. And these stairs are at the end of this hallway. Now, there's no overhead in these stairs because now you're at the top of the monument. And what's also interesting is at the top of the monument, when you raise up and look down at it, there are these holes that have been carved into the rock in almost perfect circles, about the size of a 55-gallon drum, in a line. Now, it's hypothesized that that is where they would put poles for tents or for structures, wooden poles. And it was very, very interesting to see that. And again, that's when I started leaning more towards the not nature theory, but more of the man-made. I did see structures above the water that are on the land. And these structures were in vicinity of the Seki Point, but closest to where the underwater face is. It's on the north side of the island, and these rise up about 70 feet above the water's edge, and they are carved almost identical to the monuments at a Seki Point. It really makes you feel, if you've dove a Seki Point and then you walk to these monuments, you feel like you're underwater again. If these underwater offshore objects were caused by natural causes, I would really be surprised. Now, I'm not a professional geologist. I'm a professional photographer. But you can see the similarities between what's on land and what's underwater. Now, it's obviously been underwater for a long time just by the depth. But they're carved the same way as it is on land. And conversely, what's on land is the same as what's underwater. And what's underwater is the same as what's on land. I would have to say that I just can't go with the nature theory. I would agree that the site was carved out by humans, not a natural phenomenon. And I would agree with those people for these reasons. What's underwater is so similar to what's above land. They're in vicinity of one another. If the water had infiltrated because of the end of the Ice Age, and as I've read and other people have told me and supported it with findings, is that the water has risen. I would certainly ascribe to the theory of the oceans rising that caused people at a certain time and place to leave this site, these monuments, if you will, and possibly begin to work on new monuments that are in vicinity of Iseki Point. Now, there's one thing that Professor Masaki Kimura, who is a professor in residence at the University of Ryukyu's on Okinawa, and he's done extensive published research on these monuments of Iseki Point. There's one thing that he also takes you to that I've photographed in another location of Okinawa that gives credence to this rising water theory. That is on the northern point, or Bolo Point, they call it. I'm sorry, it's not Bolo Point, it's called Heido Point on Okinawa. It's the northernmost point on Okinawa. And just around the corner from that, they've discovered, and I photographed, underwater cave structures. But what's interesting about these underwater cave structures is there's stalactites coming down, which means and stalactites are only formed by fresh water above the surface of the water. So these stalactites formed on land. These stalactites were above water for quite some time, and they're huge stalactites. Some of these stalactites are that big around, hanging down from the ceiling. It almost looks like a Christmas tree farm upside down. And I've dove on these many times and photographed them. And now this is some 350 to 400 miles away from Yonaguni. And here we have evidence that the water table has risen, infiltrated caves, and there's stalactites in these caves. So that really made me go over to the man-made side, and that these man-made structures were infiltrated by the rising waters of the oceans over time. And one other thing to report to that too was that Kimura, in his report to a professional agency in Japan, reports that they actually found man-made tools in these caves on the main island of Okinawa underwater. So I find the credence to it. And it was very exciting to see these things as well. Professor Kimura shares with me his findings that he presented to a Japanese forensic society that studies these kinds of things. And he shared his report with me while I was doing research for these articles. And it seems that they hypothesized that the civilization that was living on Yonaguni at the time, some 10,000 years ago, could have built these monuments. And then as the water tables began to rise, that they had to shift from the monuments that I dove on in Iseki Point, and they had to shift because the monuments were infiltrated with water. They had to shift to another site on Yonaguni. Now those are two sites that I photographed and I understand, and Kimura thinks this shift came some 4,000 years ago, which makes sense to me. I could see that the monuments at Iseki Point closely resembled the same rock formations that are just around the corner. And in between the Iseki Point monuments, there's been another find of recent years that I photographed, and that's where the face monument is. And so you've got the Iseki Point, this face monument, and much similar carving and man-made type things that I think are there. And then you have above land and well above water, very similar formations that look very much man-made.